Welcome back to the Dirt Diaries, explorers. Don't forget to hit subscribe so you never miss a new episode or new archaeological discovery. And if you're listening to this as a podcast, don't forget to like and rate because it really helps me out. And if you're new here, hi, welcome. I hope you love ancient history, mythology, archaeology, and more as much as I do, because my name is Dr. Tenendra Kellenberger and I bring the ancient world to you. Because no, this is not Ancient Aliens. This is the real thing, and of course, these are the Dirt Diaries. And of course, a special shout out and hello to those lounging in the villa, taking notes in the library, or snooping in the restricted section over on Patreon. And last time on Dirt Diaries, well, we took out our microscopes to see how the victorious warrior was constructed on the tiny Pylos combat agate, which was discovered in the tomb of the Griffin warrior, which is one of my absolute favorite archaeological finds and a main component of my research. Now, while the victorious warrior smites his enemy down to highlight his own power, I once again am changing it up here at Dirt Diaries as we talk a famed hunter, or huntress, I should say, that of the goddess Artemis, and her temple at Ephesus, which, yes, was one of the ancient wonders of the world. Of course, it remains as ruins today, but hey, at least we have something of it that remains, unlike many of the others that have been lost to the tides of time. And the temple here must have been an incredible sight to see, from what the ancient authors tell us about it. But the goddess here was not who we know her to be. And as always, I will be getting ready and doing my makeup with you all today to keep my hands busy. So from the Bronze Age in Greece, we move to the Archaic period, almost 1,000 years after the Griffin warrior was buried, to ancient Anatolia, where we can finally talk about the Lady of Ephesus and her temple. And the site of Ephesus is actually located on the western coast of modern-day Turkey, also known as the Ionian coast, which back in the ancient day and time was going to be Anatolia. And today, Ephesus is actually located just outside the modern town and city of Selçuk. Now, this entire area of Ephesus over here has long been known as a sacred site. Of course, not only by the ancient Greeks, but of course the later Romans. And even past them, because we will, of course, at the end, be talking a little bit more about how the area was viewed in terms of later Abrahamic traditions and religions. Now, the sacredity of the ancient site of Ephesus was actually long believed to be older than the site of Didyma, which we're going to talk about this, but from a mythological standpoint, this is kind of hilarious if you can read between the mythical story and read between the mythical lines here, because the site of Didyma was actually famed for its not only sanctuary and temple to the god Apollo, but also for being an oracular site as well, meaning there was an oracle to the god Apollo there. And who is Apollo, you might be wondering? Well, Apollo is the younger twin of Artemis. Yeah, he was actually born second. And because Didyma was really the site of Apollo, one of the major sites of Apollo, of course, not as big as Delphi over on the mainland of Greece, but Ephesus was really Artemis's domain, where she was highly worshipped and venerated. So, yes, the siblings and their perspective sites were steeped in mythology and legend. Now, while of course the site and the temple of Artemis was known throughout the ancient world, it was also part of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, which, side note, really quick, but did you know that there's actually multiple lists of wonders of the world? There's the ancient wonders of the world, there's the 7 wonders of the modern world, and there's also, from my knowledge, a list of 7 wonders of the Middle Ages, the medieval period. It's something like that, but I didn't realize there was more than one list. I thought it was just the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and we just capped it at that. I knew about the modern ones, and how, funny enough, the pyramids of Giza or the Great Pyramid, I should say, is actually on both lists. But yeah, I did not realize that there was also lists in between as well. And you may be wondering, what were the other 7 wonders of the world? Because we are really tackling today one of these 7 wonders. So of course, I already kind of spoiled it with the Great Pyramid of Giza, which is also known as the Pyramid to Khufu. And then we have the Temple to Artemis at Ephesus. Then we have the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. We have the Colossus at Rhodes. We have the Mausoleum of Halicarnassus, the Statue of Zeus at Olympia, and the Lighthouse of Alexandria. Alrighty, back to the point of our story. So already, we can see that this area is steeped in mythology, legend, and more. But not only do these 2 sites, Ephesus and Didyma, have ties to the famed mythological twins of Greek mythology, but nearby, at the site of Ortygia, in some stories, the Titaness Leto actually gave birth to her twin children, Artemis and Apollo. But the other area that is famously known for being the birthplace of the mythological twins, Artemis and Apollo, is actually the Cycladic island of Delos. And I just went there in my summer travels, so we could do a whole episode on that in the future. As the tale goes with areas really connected to ancient mythology, people want to find them. Archaeologists were already looking for this site. And of course, we already kind of saw this on the Dirt Diaries with Heinrich Schliemann going to Mycenae, digging for Troy, looking for where the Greek heroes who fought the Battle of Troy were buried at Grave Circle A. And from last week's episode, we also saw, how there was a desire to look for the Palace of Nestor and where Carl Blagan and his team actually discovered it. So we're already seeing this occur even prior to these 2. Now, before our buddy Heinrich Schliemann even opened a trench at Troy, in 1863, archaeologists were already on the hunt, not for the kingdom of Priam and his treasures. Nay, they were looking for the Temple of Artemis. And I even have my little Artemis bust out today as well. That's right, in 1869, under 6 meters of mud, the Temple of Artemis was uncovered by archaeologist John T. Wood. And if you're a curious little kitty cat like me, the T stands for turtle, which is a really cool middle name, John Turtle Wood. Sure as hell makes Jean, my middle name, not as flashy. Anywho, these excavations were actually done through the British Museum in London. And during their many excavation seasons at the site, several incredible and important artifacts were uncovered, including the famed marble statues depicting the Lady of Ephesus, which we will dive into. Now, it took from 1869 to 1874 until the area was cleaned and cleared for a considerable distance beyond the lowest step of the platform on which the last phase of the temple resided. It took 5 seasons. And after enough was cleared away to get an understanding of really the foundations, Wood was able to construct a floor plan. And during this period, the earliest artifacts that were uncovered at this site actually dated to the 7th century BCE, and they were in the form of precious metal figurines of the goddess. In fact, I know a common metal that was used to create these figurines was actually silver. And the Temple of Artemis here at the site of Ephesus was a massive cultic center and religious center to the goddess Artemis that became literally the national emblem of Ephesus. And while this temple has an incredibly long history, it's also full of destruction because yes, this temple was destroyed multiple times. This temple did not have an easy lifetime. And while we know that the area where the temple resides has ties to myth, legend, and more, we already know it's sacred. But even before that, the site has a long history of settlement and use, even before the temple was constructed. Ephesus itself, from an archaeological perspective, and remains actually suggests that there had been occupation in the area since the Bronze Age. But of course, it wouldn't be until much after the Bronze Age, until the Archaic period, that the temple actually was constructed. In the 8th century BCE. And the first iteration of this temple was not the temple that our ancient authors were writing about, that these ancient authors like Strabo and more were obsessed with, that had their breath taken away. No, this is an early iteration of the temple. But this 8th century BCE temple was important on its own for a number of reasons. It was pretty remarkable. Why? Because it was actually one of the first peripteral Greek temples, meaning it was a temple with columns surrounding all of the sides. But unfortunately, the story and tales of destruction really begins in the 7th century BCE, when the first temple, this first iteration of the temple, was destroyed in a flood. Now, hop, skip, and a bit later, we get the Lydian king, Croesus. And as kings do, well, he conquered the area. Of course, this included the area of Ephesus, where the temple once stood. And he conquered the area in about 560-ish and some change, between 550 and 560 BCE. But then, after conquering the area, he actually took it upon himself as a good king to fund the reconstruction of the Temple of Artemis. And yes, archaeological finds also support this, as there has been the finding of an inscription on one of the column drums that reads, "Dedicated by Croesus." But temples back in the day, they were not put up overnight. And Croesus's building project and reconstruction of the temple to Artemis actually took 120 years to complete. And when completed, the new standing temple was almost double the size of the Parthenon at Athens in the 5th century BCE. Now this temple, wow. This temple had 127 columns, which were 60 feet high and 4 feet wide. And these were actually arranged in double rows on every side. And the decorative program for what the friezes on the outside were decorated with, what scenes did they have? They actually, of course, included scenes with ties to Greek mythology, including those that involved Amazons. Why? Because in mythology, the Amazons supposedly sought shelter at Ephesus. Why? Because they were seeking shelter from Heracles. And at this point in time, and even when reconstruction began on this second iteration of the temple, well, there was already a cultic statue of the goddess Artemis in the temple. During this period, however, it was crafted out of cedar wood, where later renditions of this statue were crafted out of marble. So because one of the original statues, cultic statues of Artemis, were created out of cedar wood, it doesn't survive, unfortunately. Why? Because wood is organic material, and a lot of times it just doesn't survive in the archaeological record. So, the temple was completed. Huzzah! We've got the second iteration of the temple. Great. King Croesus would be proud. Until it was deliberately destroyed by an ancient arsonist. Yes, by a man known as Herostratus in 356 BCE. Why, you might be wondering? Why did this man want to risk the wrath of a Greek goddess? You might be wondering. It's because this man's sole goal in life, it said, was to be famous for a crime and having his name immortalized in history because of it. So a little PSA, a little Dirt Diaries PSA, and a Dr. 10 tip, maybe get better hobbies. Maybe we don't aspire to do this. Maybe we don't aspire to be a infamous arsonist in history. Maybe, just maybe. I don't know. Honestly, get a better goal in life. Maybe knitting, maybe reading, crocheting, perhaps cooking. We don't need to be lighting fires. Now, our buddy Plutarch, who was writing much later on, he was actually writing about the life of Alexander the Great. And when he was writing, he actually made mention about this fire back in the 4th century BCE. Why? Because our buddy Plutarch actually states that the reason the temple burned down in flames was because the goddess was out. She wasn't home. Artemis at this point was actually tending to the birth of Alexander the Great. So that's why the temple burned down and was allowed to burn down, because the goddess was out and about doing her goddess duties and helping with childbirth. And if you're wondering, Artemis, she's associated with childbirth. Yes, a fun fact about Artemis is she was born first from her mom, and then her mom actually continued to labor for 9 more days with her brother. And by that point, she had fully grown, and she helped her mother deliver her brother. So yes, she does have ties to childbirth. And fun fact about Alexander the Great is we just passed his birthday. It's believed he was actually born on July 21st, 356 BCE. Now, after this temple burned down, well, some Magi and other people, they actually took this as an omen, an ill omen at that, right? Kind of makes sense because, when temples go down, you might be thinking, hey, maybe the gods are mad at us. Maybe we need to do something. But not everybody was convinced it was a bad omen or, a sign of not great things. And instead, they went ahead and began plans to rebuild it again. In fact, this didn't slow them down one bit, because the architects actually rebuilt the temple to almost the same size in the same position that the older one was just destroyed on. Now, excavations for this Hellenistic rendition of the temple to Artemis here actually show that it was just a tad smaller. It was just a tad smaller than before in terms of length and width of the temple, and the columns, where they were previously about 60 feet high, this time they were only about 58 feet high. So just a smidge smaller. Now, to account for size, because yes, size mattered in the ancient world, the temple was actually constructed on a higher base to appear larger and therefore more imposing over the environment that it was in. And for ancient architecture specifically if we look at ancient Greek architecture, there are many tricks to add height, to add the illusion of length, to add the illusion that something is much bigger or more symmetrical. It's so fascinating. And well, Alexander the Great, he grew up and he, in time, made his way to Ephesus. He took a little side quest when he was busy trying to conquer the known world at the time. And when he got to the site in 334 BCE, which is just a few years before he passes, he actually offered to help with the expenses of rebuilding the temple to Artemis. But, he wasn't just going to give money away for nothing. So he said, I'll give you guys the funds for the reconstruction of the temple if, and there's always an if once completed, you let it be known that I helped out with an inscription. Okay. He says, you know what? I'll rub your back if you engrave my name into the temple. And the Ephesians at the time, they're trying to figure it out. They're trying to figure out how they're going to fund this. They're really trying to make this work. So there comes to be an agreement, not between Alexander and the Ephesians, but the Ephesians amongst themselves. That's right, because they really come together and decide, hey, we don't want him to help out financially. Why, you might be wondering? Because they didn't want to feel as though they owed him anything, and they also didn't want to have his influence on the site. They didn't want him to have control over anything. They wanted to be able to do it with no strings attached. But, they had to make sure that they weren't offending Alexander the Great. So, in order to not offend Alexander, the Ephesians came back to him and said, you are too kind. Thank you so much. But we cannot accept such a grand gesture from you. Why? Because it wouldn't be right for a god such as yourself to present gifts to another god. So why would this, strike home for Alexander? Well, by this point in time, Alexander really had been recognized as the son of multiple gods. He had visited a few oracular sites, and had this confirmed. So the Ephesians were going to use that to their advantage here. Well, Alexander, you're already the son of a god, therefore divine yourself. We couldn't possibly accept this from you. It wouldn't be right for a god to make a gift to another god. So thanks very much, but we've got it from here. And well played by the Ephesians, I must say, because if you know, you can read between the lines and understand that it was a power and political move on their end to not be under his influence. Okay, and they did it respectfully. Now, of course, after Alexander the Great's visit and even after his death, the site of Ephesus is still extremely important, and the temple, once rebuilt, is again a symbol of Ephesus. It is really the cultic center, the religious center in the ancient world for Artemis. While the site of Ephesus today is located a short drive away from the ancient temple, that's because the ruins and the site as it is today is actually another phase of Ephesus. That's right, there were actually 3 phases of Ephesus itself. And the reason that the area that the site occupies actually shifted over time was because the ancient individuals, the Ephesians, were following the ancient port, the ancient harbor. They really relied on trade coming in and having all of these different connections in order to survive and thrive. In fact, if you go there today to the site of Ephesus, where the ancient port was, it now sits a few miles inland. And this is just what happened and changed over time historically. So the ancient harbor today is actually pretty inland. But from the earlier phases of Ephesus that were located closer to the Temple of Artemis, they actually had to shift the city and move it because the environment was changing and therefore pushing the port to a different area. So as the water and therefore economy moved, people moved with it. And after the temple was rebuilt again, well, it lasted a lot longer this time. But in 267 CE, the temple was destroyed by the Goths, and then following its destruction in the 3rd century CE, it was partially restored. But after its partial reconstruction, well, about a century and some change later, after the decree set forth by Theodosius I, that really called pagan temples to close their doors because Christianity by that point had become the main religion of the Roman Empire. Well, in 401 CE, what remained of the temple was destroyed by a Christian mob. And thus, following that, there was even more, I don't want to say looting, but taking of the stone from the structures to help build other building projects. And that's totally normal for the time. And even before that, much older buildings were actually repurposed and the materials were reused because you had perfectly good material right there. So a lot of it also just was taken after 401 as well. So even though the temple stayed where it always originally was and the town and city moved around it, that actually is pretty fitting with the goddess Artemis herself. As goddess of the hunt and wild beasts and even, freedom in nature, Artemis was also believed to preside over boundaries. And its location being just outside of the city makes sense. It is a boundary between the known and the unknown, between the city, the town, and, kind of man-made order as compared to the natural world, to the wilderness, to wild animals. So boundaries there make sense. And, we've gotten this far, and you're probably, maybe asking yourself this question: who is Artemis? We know she's the sister of Apollo, but what else? Well, she is the older of the twins. Her mother was the Titaness Leto, and their father was the king of the gods himself, Zeus. And Artemis in Greek mythology is a force to be reckoned with. She presides over wild animals, the hunt, childbirth, and more. And if you're wondering, her Roman counterpart is Diana. Apollo in the Roman world, he keeps his name. He keeps the name Apollo. And her temple was the capital THE, bold, italicized, underlined temple to her in the ancient world. If we look at Delphi as being the site for Apollo, Ephesus and the Temple of Artemis was the temple for Artemis in the ancient world. And normally, when I say, think of Artemis and, any artwork that is associated with her, many of you may picture her running with wild animals, with deer, with a bow and arrow, with a quiver on her back, or even like this one here, which is known as the Artemis of Versailles, also known as the Diana of Versailles. We already in our minds have an idea of how the Greek goddess Artemis is depicted in art. Some of you out there might think, oh, I can picture, a statue of her running with wild animals, wearing a short tunic. Sometimes one of her breasts may be out. You may know her as having maybe a little crescent moon diadem. You may know her as having, deer alongside her in iconography. All of this makes sense in your brain for how Artemis is depicted in ancient art. And while Artemis is a goddess associated with childbirth, she is a virgin goddess. And there's a few virgin goddesses in Greek mythology. We famously have Athena. We also have Hestia, who are two well-known virgin goddesses as well. Also, there is discourse on Hecate being viewed as a virgin goddess. And then in other legends and stories, some have argued that Hecate is actually the mother of Medea and others. But the major known virgin goddesses are going to be Athena, Hestia, Artemis, and Hecate, asterisk. Now, this is really interesting. She's a virgin goddess. She's associated with childbirth. And when we think of her, we think of imagery like this. So what is going on with how she looks at Ephesus? Because, you guys, she looks completely different. Now, here, with her imagery and sculpture and just how she was worshipped and venerated, Artemis, was really viewed as the Lady of Ephesus. And her imagery and cultic worship was really influenced with local tradition and with iconography and beliefs coming from the East, from Mesopotamia. Because here we see a different take on Artemis. Here we see almost a combination or a synchronization of Artemis, who's a Greek goddess, with that of a local Phrygian goddess and a local older Anatolian mother goddess. That of Cybele. And yes, for those wondering, Cybele has her own worship, veneration, and more. And fun fact, Cybele also has a mystery cult in the ancient world. But here at Ephesus, Artemis and Cybele are almost coming together in one goddess. And even more so, the imagery of the Lady of Ephesus here also has some ties iconographically to the much larger mistress of animals. And when we have Artemis depicted this way, many often refer to her as Artemis Ephesia, meaning Artemis of Ephesus, or as the Lady of Ephesus. And already, if you look at this image, the first thing that you are probably noticing is that this statue likely has ties to fertility, which may pose the question to you, well, if she's a virgin goddess, how and why is she being shown as a goddess of fertility? Well, as Artemis rules over the hunt, wild animals, and more, and has ties to liminal spaces and boundaries, you could argue that she could have associations to the fertility of the land and, nature and everything with animals. And as a goddess who was commonly associated with childbirth and who was often called in to help pregnant women help deliver a baby safely in the ancient day, well, childbirth is also seen as an aspect of fertility. And, while she was called in to help assist with childbirth, Artemis was also known as a protector of young girls, as a protector of children. So the emphasis on this statue here is on fertility and the ties that these goddesses, Cybele, Artemis, the larger mistress of animals, who in the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean world is also referred to as the Potnia Theron. So the emphasis here is on fertility and the ties these goddesses share with the natural world around them. So in this statue, we see a conglomeration of Greek, of Phrygian, and other Near Eastern aspects. The laurel crown up top on one of these statues that survives today is actually a direct reference to a crown worn notably by Cybele. Other goddesses do wear a laurel crown, and when you hear the word laurel crown, you are probably thinking of the laurel branch wreath that was awarded to winners of early Olympics and games, laurel also being sacred to the god Apollo. But laurel crown here actually means it's a crown of city walls. Why would a goddess wear a crown depicting city walls? It's because many of these goddesses were also seen as protective goddesses, also goddesses who were protectors of the cities that they were being worshipped and venerated in. So Cybele is well known for wearing the laurel crown. I've seen images of Tyche depicted with a laurel crown as well, and of course her Roman counterpart being Fortuna. On the breastplate of the Lady of Ephesus, we actually have zodiac signs, and the zodiac on her breastplate actually denotes direct ties to Babylon and the celestial movements throughout the year that these goddesses reigned over. So if you're thinking, well, how does the year affect, how these goddesses are viewed? Well, think of it in terms of fertility, land fertility as well. In spring, animals are usually giving birth to their young, and all of the animals surrounding her on her dress, sometimes in her headdress, and standing right next to her, of course, show direct ties to Artemis's association with the hunt, with wild animals, and the associations that all of these goddesses have to the natural world around them. And here, front and center, we see all of these bulbs on her body. Now, there has been discourse about what these may actually represent, with some scholars denoting that these may actually be representations of breasts. So for breastfeeding, fertility that way. And you may be wondering, where is this iconography coming from? We actually see similar versions of this on the goddess Isis. And there's also been discourse and discussions on the fact that these are not breasts, but that they could be eggs. Why eggs? It could be offerings to the goddesses. If not eggs, there's also been discourse about how these may be representational of bull testicles to symbolize the sacrifices of bulls that were made in her honor. And if not bull testicles, there has also been the postulation that these actually represent bees coming together. So think of when bees are, in flowers and you just see the little bee butts sticking out, that's what this could represent. We also, on the side of her dress, on the Lady of Ephesus statues, we do see representation of bees. But whatever they represented, whatever they meant, they were symbolic to these ancient peoples. And they were significant enough to cover a good portion of these two statues. And when I was visiting Ephesus over the summer and went to the museum, the archaeological museum in Ephesus, because I love museums, I was able to see these two statues in person, and truly everything that you think you know about images of Artemis in the ancient world truly gets shattered when you look at these in person. And all of the incredible details on her headdress, in her face, her entire body is just so beautifully depicted. And to see the craft, the talent, the effort, the energy put into crafting these images of the goddess is truly just breathtaking. The museum also has a reconstruction model of what the temple would have looked like, and in the center of it, in the back, is actually a little model version of the Lady of Ephesus statue, as she likely would have been shown and placed in the ancient temple. And as you can see from this image, there's actually two small quadrupeds on either side of her. 10. What's a quadruped? A quadruped really just means it's an animal that we can't identify, but it does have 4 legs. So in archaeology or archaeological reports, if we can't tell if it's a sheep, goat, dog, cow, pig, any animal that has 4 legs, a great term that we use in reports to show our uncertainty is just a quadruped, to let anybody else know it's an animal and it has 4 legs, and this is what we can say. So on this one image, we actually have two quadrupeds on either side of her. And this really, in my mind, rings true to how she's depicted as the Artemis of Versailles and other renditions of Artemis statues, where she is running with dogs, where she is running with deer. It's so beautiful. And literally, I could have stayed for hours in this one room of these two statues. And just, it was incredible to just stand there and be in awe of how she was depicted and what she meant to these ancient individuals. And of course, the cultic site of the temple of Artemis and her worship was so important, not only to the locals, not only to the people here and their worship and their religious observance here at Ephesus, but it was known throughout the entire ancient world. It was a beacon for her worship. For festivals, processions, sacrifices, games, and more were held in her honor here. And going to the temple after, Ephesus and the museum, going to the remains and the ruins of the temple today is breathtaking, because while only one column remains today, just being in the area, you already feel like, yes, I understand why people were building a temple here. There's just something about it, if that makes sense. And as I said earlier, the area itself where the temple is and was located actually does share ties with later Abrahamic religions. So if you ever go there, and I have an image up for you guys, but if you are standing at the temple and you look up the mountainside, or the hillside, I should say, in between you and the top of the hill, there is, I believe, a medieval mosque there. And then further up the hill, on top of it actually, is the Baptistry of St. John, which is of course part of the larger Basilica of St. John up at the top. But already right there, we are having three major religions in the same area, understanding that this was a sacred area for so many people over so much time. We have the Greeks and their Olympian gods being worshipped here. We then have the Basilica of St. John at the top of the hill for early and emerging Christianity and its worship. And then we also have a mosque from the medieval period for the people who practice Islam. And it's these kind of things that, maybe it's because I teach sacred space at a university where I teach my students how individuals of three major religions of the time, so pagan Rome, people of the Jewish faith, and early Christianity and Catholicism, how they were interacting not only with one another, but how they were defining sacred space for their own worship and religious practice, how they were connecting to their god or their gods. And it's being in these places that you really see the connections between it all. That, sure, while there are separate religions out there and at the site itself, there's so many similarities that these three religions were able to understand that this is a sacred area, that this area had a long history together. And I don't know, it was something that I just noticed while being there, that was something special, that even the ancient individuals, even of different religions and faiths back in the day, they understood this area as being part of a much larger sacred space. And I like to think the ancients would still think it's pretty cool that we're still talking about their ancient temples and more. And if you would like to come and see the Lady of Ephesus herself and the ruins and remains of one of the ancient wonders of the world, and of course the much larger site of Ephesus as it remains today, we're heading back to Turkey next year if you'd like to come and see the Lady of Ephesus herself, see really the epicenter of the worship of the goddess Artemis. It was truly incredible and life-changing, and I'm so excited to be able to head back and just geek out with everybody over Greek mythology, ancient history, archaeology, and more. So, as always, keep your books open, stay curious, and I'll see you guys next time on the Dirt Diaries.